Hey, everyone. Welcome to Storytelling Time, the place where every story comes alive. If you love getting lost in thrilling tales, gripping mysteries, and epic adventures, you're in the right spot. I'm your storyteller, and here, we don't just tell stories, we bring them to life. Whether it's fantasy, mystery, horror, or even a bit of comedy, we're all about immersion. So grab a snack, get comfy, and prepare for a journey that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single chapter. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the Storytelling Time family. Let's dive into the stories that await, starting now. 93 miles per hour, the speedometer stubbornly declared, each digit illuminated by the sickly green glow of the dashboard. Frank Marcheton's foot remained heavy on the accelerator, the aging pickup truck vibrating in protest. He had no destination, no plan beyond outrunning the silence that had been his unwelcome companion since the lawyer's sterile office. The ghastly blue moonlight painted the surrounding farmland in stark, skeletal hues. Another swig of lukewarm beer did little to cut through the raw ache in his chest. The windows were down, the rush of the cold night air a fleeting distraction, a physical counterpoint to the emotional numbness threatening to engulf him. Beer dribbled onto his chin, a pathetic testament to his unraveling. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his worn blue flannel, the fabric already damp with spilled grief and cheap lager. The empty can clattered onto the passenger floor, joining its brethren in a growing pile of discarded solace. On the seat beside him lay the manila envelope, a stark rectangle against the faded upholstery. It held the crisp, impersonal words that had shattered his world, delivered with the practiced indifference of a stranger in a suit. He reached for another beer, the last one in the six-pack. 2 remained. His gaze flickered to the envelope, and his knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. She couldn't even face me, the bitter thought clawed its way to the surface. Sent some clean-cut drone to do her dirty work. The needle on the speedometer nudged towards the century mark. The road began its slow ascent up a low hill, the engine roaring its discontent beneath Frank. He didn't ease off the gas. As the crest came into view, a flickering neon sign pierced the darkness in the distance. Restmore Inn, vacancy, it pulsed, perched beside a lonely off-ramp that veered sharply right into the black maw of the countryside. A jolt of something akin to impulse, or perhaps just the beer-addled desire for oblivion, seized him. Frank jerked the wheel at the last possible second. Tires shrieked in protest, the brakes slammed down hard. The truck fishtailed violently, spitting gravel from the shoulder as he fought to maintain control. A string of curses escaped his lips as he wrestled with the steering wheel, careening down the ramp like a drunken roller coaster. The glowing red vacancy sign pulsed with a weak, erratic beat as he finally lurched into the parking lot. The place exuded an air of profound abandonment. No lights flickered in the windows. No movement stirred. A dead silence hung heavy in the cold air as he rolled to a stop in the cracked gravel motor court. A lone figure emerged from the dimly lit office, silhouetted against the yellow glow spilling from the doorway. The motel attendant, a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to absorb the meager light, watched Frank's unsteady approach with open suspicion. "I'd like a room for the night," Frank mumbled, trying to inject a semblance of sobriety into his slurred words. "Only got one left," the attendant replied, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. He eyed Frank up and down. "Queen bed. $60. Cash only." "That'll do," Frank muttered, fumbling through the worn leather of his wallet. He peeled off 3 crumpled $20 bills and slid them across the counter. The attendant snatched them with a disconcerting swiftness and dropped a heavy metal room key into Frank's outstretched hand. The tag, tarnished with age, read simply, "Number 6. The paint on the motel door peeled away in brittle strips, revealing the aged wood beneath. The weathered, rusted number 6 clung stubbornly to the frame. A single window, glazed over with years of accumulated dirt and grime, sat to the right of the door, offering no glimpse of the interior. The Restmorin was no roadside oasis, but it would serve its purpose for the night, a place to momentarily cease his relentless flight. As Frank finally stepped inside room 6, the neon sign outside pulsed one last time, the red letters shifting, "No vacancy." He returned to the truck, the cold seeping into his bones, and retrieved the meager remnants of his life, a half-zipped backpack containing a single change of clothes, the 2 remaining cans of beer, and the damning manila envelope labeled in stark block print, Frank Marcheton. He sat heavily on the edge of the worn bedspread, the springs groaning beneath his weight. For the first time since the lawyer's pronouncement, the oppressive silence and stillness of the room offered him a space to think, a space he had been desperately trying to outrun. The weight of it all crashed down on him with brutal force. Tears welled in his eyes before he could suppress them, a raw, physical manifestation of his shattered heart. He instinctively turned his head towards the peeling wallpaper, a childish attempt to hide his vulnerability. But the more he tried to contain the rising tide of grief, the harder it became to swallow, until it finally spilled over in ragged sobs that shook his entire body. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture futile against the fresh wave of sorrow. He reached for one of the last 2 beers, his fingers trembling so violently that the cold aluminum can slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor and rolling out of reach. It vanished beneath the bed. "Damn it," Frank groaned, leaning over the side of the mattress. He dropped to his knees, lifting the dusty bed skirt. And then he froze. Something was down there. Not just the errant beer can. A shape. A gap in the floorboards. He blinked, thinking his blurry vision was playing tricks on him. But then he heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, followed by the faintest of whispers, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He strained to decipher the unintelligible murmurs. He leaned in closer, his ear inches from the floor, trying to make sense of the strange whispers. And then he heard it again. Scrape. Scrape. A sudden chill snaked down his spine, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. Without conscious thought, he stood and shoved the bed to the side. The metal frame shrieked against the aged linoleum, the sound grating like fingernails on a chalkboard. Staring back at him was a wooden-framed hatch set into the floorboards where the bed had just been. The handle was made of heavy, black iron, shaped like a cold, accusing ring. Strange, ornate carvings wrapped around the edges of the hatch frame, symbols he didn't recognize but instinctively disliked, a primal unease settling in his gut. Frank gripped the iron ring. It was cold and rough beneath his fingers. He pulled. The hatch resisted with a stubbornness that suggested decades of disuse, heavy and unyielding. It groaned with protest at every inch it reluctantly gave way. A wave of stale, musty air, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic, washed over him as the opening widened. He fumbled for his cell phone in his pocket and clicked on the flashlight app. The beam of light reached the threshold of the open hatch, then abruptly stopped. It simply vanished, swallowed by an impenetrable darkness as if the shadows beneath refused to be illuminated. A knot of fear tightened in his chest, battling with a morbid curiosity. He hesitated for only a moment before taking a reckless leap into the unknown, the darkness below engulfing him completely. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing in on him from all sides. Then, as suddenly as it had descended, the blackness began to thin. He found himself standing on solid ground, disoriented. He was strangely back in his room, but different. Everything was leached of color, rendered in shades of gray. The desk, the door, the bed, all were in their familiar places, yet drained of vibrancy. The hatch in the floor was gone, replaced by clean, seamless hardwood. And there, just in front of the bed, lay the perfectly still beer can on its side. He turned his head and looked up. In the ceiling, directly above where the hatch had been, a dark void remained, sharply outlined in the same rectangular shape. It was still there, an exit, a silent promise of return. For now, that was enough. A flicker of something akin to resolve, cold and fragile, steadied him. Frank turned away from the unsettling void in the ceiling and began to explore the monochromatic stillness of room 6. Frank picked up the fallen beer can, its aluminum surface cold and strangely inert in his hand. He turned it over slowly, his eyes scanning the muted gray of the label, a mirror image of the one he discarded upstairs. A prickle of unease crawled beneath his skin. He cracked it open. The familiar hiss of escaping carbonation sounded jarringly normal in the silent, colorless room. He lifted it to his nose. It smelled like beer, metallic and slightly stale. Just as he raised the can to his lips, a soft creak echoed from the front door of the grayscale room. Frank froze, the can halfway to his mouth. He hadn't touched the door. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper shadow hinting at something beyond. He set the beer down carefully on the floor and slowly pushed the door open wider, his senses on high alert. He peered outside. The parking lot was gone. In its place stretched an endless void of absolute darkness, a stark contrast to the muted tones of his room. He looked down the walkway, or what he assumed was the walkway, noting the outlines of adjacent motel rooms, all rendered in the same oppressive gray as his own. A hesitant curiosity, battling his growing apprehension, drew him forward. He made his way down the walkway towards where room 4 should be. A faint, sickly glow emanated from the slightly cracked open door. It was a pale, almost bioluminescent light, casting long, distorted shadows in the gray landscape. Peering through the narrow opening, Frank saw a middle-aged man in a stark black suit standing precariously atop a small, gray end table. The man's shoulders shook with silent sobs, his face a mask of utter despair, etched in shades of charcoal. "I'm sorry. I can't. I just can't anymore," the man's voice trembled, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to vibrate in the still air. Then Frank noticed the noose. A thick, gray rope was tightly wrapped around the man's neck, the other end tethered to an unseen beam above. A horrifying realization dawned on Frank. Frantically, propelled by a sudden surge of adrenaline, he burst through the door, intending to stop the unthinkable. He lunged towards the man, his hand outstretched. But as he reached him, Frank stumbled forward, passing right through the man as if he were nothing more than smoke. He fell to the cold, gray floor, landing hard. Looking back, he watched in stunned disbelief as the man on the table kicked the small piece of furniture away. The gray rope snapped taut, and the man's body swung lifelessly, a grotesque pendulum against the monochrome backdrop. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything vanished. The room blinked back to a slightly different state, the table upright, the man back in place, tears still silently streaming down his gray face, the noose still looped around his neck. The loop began again. The silent sob. The whispered apology. The kick. The swing. Frank stayed low on the floor, watching the horrific tableau unfold in stunned silence. The grief etched into the man's face was bottomless, a silent scream of eternal despair. It was as if he had been condemned to repeat this final, agonizing moment for eternity. A wave of nausea washed over Frank. He scrambled back to his feet, a profound sense of unease settling deep within him. This place, this wasn't just a strange, colorless version of the motel. It was something far more sinister. Leaving the repeating horror of room 4 behind, Frank made his way further down the walkway towards where room 2 should be, a heavy dread tightening in his chest. Each step felt leaden, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of his own heart. The door to room 2 was ajar, just like before, casting that same faint, sickly glow onto the gray walkway. He hesitated at the threshold, a desperate hope flickering within him that this room might be empty, untouched by the palpable despair of the last. He prayed to a God he hadn't thought about in years. Peering inside, he saw no one. A sliver of relief, fragile and fleeting, flickered within him. But the bed was a chaotic mess of rumpled gray sheets, scattered with women's clothing and accessories, all rendered in varying shades of gray. Pointed heels lay on the floor like fallen dominoes, a purse lay half unzipped on the nightstand, and smudges that could only be makeup were brushed across the sheets, as if someone had left in a desperate hurry. Clink. Frank jumped at the sudden, sharp sound of something small hitting the gray tile floor. It came from the bathroom, the door of which was also partially open, casting a sliver of that eerie light. He stepped forward, each footfall heavier than the last, and moved slowly towards the bathroom door. Sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, was a woman. Her clothes, a light blue tank top and jeans in the real world, were now just lighter and darker shades of gray. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. Her head lolled lazily to one side. In her hand, she clutched a small, cylindrical bottle. More identical bottles were scattered around her on the gray tile, some open, others spilled, tiny gray pills lying like bleached bones in dust. In a final, feeble attempt to speak, a whisper escaped her lips, barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves. "They will appreciate me, when I'm gone." She tilted her head back and emptied the contents of the bottle in her hand into her mouth, swallowing the gray pills dry. Her breathing shallowed, her eyelids fluttered, and then, stillness. A blink. Suddenly, she was sitting upright again, the same bottle clutched in her hand. The scattered pills rearranged themselves on the floor. The spilled contents vanished. The line repeated, the same flat, gray whisper, "They'll appreciate me when I'm gone." Frank stumbled backward, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was witnessing death on repeat, a silent, gray echo of tragedy. The air in the gray walkway felt thick with the weight of their despair, a palpable miasma of sorrow and finality. This place wasn't just a motel, it was a repository of last moments, a gallery of grief frozen in time. He had seen enough. A desperate need for answers, for escape, clawed at him. He turned and ran back towards the office, the image of the swinging man and the still woman burned into his mind. He had to find someone, anyone, who could explain this horrifying place. To his surprise, someone was tending to the counter in the grayscale office. A figure stood behind it, their form indistinct in the dim, sickly light. Relief, sharp and unexpected, pierced through Frank's terror. A chance for answers. "Hey!" Frank called out, his voice hoarse and shaky. "What is this place?" The figure turned to face him. And Frank stopped dead in his tracks. The clerk's face looked as if it had been violently rearranged from underneath. His lower jaw was twisted at an unnatural angle, shredded and barely held together by shadow and sinew. Yet, a wide, unsettling smile stretched across the ruined visage, a grotesque parody of human expression. And in his gray eyes, Frank saw a chilling awareness, a sentience that the trapped souls lacked. This creature wasn't in a loop. It was present. The clerk reached towards Frank with a gnarled, gray hand, the fingers unnaturally long and thin. "Enjoying your stay, Mr. Marsh-Eaton?" the voice rasped, a dry, grating sound like stones grinding together. Frank stood his ground, a cold dread settling in the pit of his stomach. "What kind of fucked up place is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravado. "What happened to those people?" The clerk's head tilted at an impossible angle, the ruined jaw creaking softly. "All is right. They came here for the same reasons you did. No, Frank choked out, the images of the hanging man and the still woman flashing behind his eyes. No, they didn't deserve this. They're trapped, tormented, stuck in their last moments. You need to let them go. Now. The sickly light above flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows across the clerk's horrifying face. The clerk's smile widened, stretching the gray skin where no jaw should have been. The sound it made was wet and sickening. Frank stumbled backward, a primal fear seizing him. The clerk began to shift, his form contorting in unnatural ways. His arms stretched, elongating like rubber, his fingers splitting and sprouting into thin, twitching tendrils that reached towards Frank. "Come now, Mr. Marsh-Eden," the voice rasped, growing harsher, more fragmented, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. "You belong here. Do what you came to do." Frank turned and bolted, scrambling back the way he came, his heart hammering against his ribs. The gray walkway ahead seemed to stretch and warp like rubber beneath his feet. The numbered doors pulsed with a hot, white light in the monochrome world. From behind each one, silent screams seemed to echo in the oppressive stillness, the frozen agony of the dead trapped in their endless suffering. He ran harder, faster, each step feeling sluggish, as if he were wading through thick mud. Behind him, the clerk was no longer just a distorted man. The thing had sprouted too many limbs, its gray, spindly arms spidering along the ceiling of the office, its movements unsettlingly fluid. Its head turned a full 180 degrees, its ruined face still fixed on him with that horrifying smile. The creature emitted a screech, a silent tearing sound that resonated deep within Frank's bones, and lunged. Instinct took over. Frank veered sharply to his left, throwing himself towards the open doorway of room 6. His eyes locked onto the dark void in the ceiling, the only exit he knew. He jumped, his fingers grasping at empty air. Gasping, he scrambled back to the doorway and slammed the gray door shut just as the creature's elongated silhouette filled the frame. He shoved the heavy, gray bed beneath the void in the ceiling, its silent scraping against the floor a desperate sound. He leapt onto the mattress, reaching upward, still agonizingly too far. Thinking fast, his mind racing with a desperate clarity, he dragged the two small, gray end tables across the room, stacking them precariously on the bed. The furniture groaned silently under his weight as he climbed the shaky tower, the gray mattress shifting precariously beneath him with every move. The gray window behind him imploded inward, shattering into 1,000 silent shards that rained down around him. The creature had smashed through, its thin, gray tendrils whipping towards him like hungry vines. One brushed his ankle as he finally pulled himself up, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the edge of the void. And then, silence. The oppressive grayness dissolved, replaced by the familiar dim light of his real motel room. Back in the relative normalcy of his own motel room, the sudden return felt jarring, almost dreamlike. But the lingering chill in the air, the phantom sensation of the creature's tendril brushing his ankle, and the frantic thumping of his heart were undeniably real. Frank didn't waste a second questioning the impossible. He grabbed his backpack and the manila envelope from the bed, his hands still trembling violently. He bolted for the door, fumbling with the unfamiliar weight of the metal key in his haste. He threw the door open and stumbled out onto the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The flickering Restmore INN, vacancy sign seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy in the dim moonlight. He didn't look back. He scrambled into his pickup truck, the familiar scent of stale coffee and worn upholstery a small comfort in the lingering terror. His hands shook so badly he could barely insert the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, the roar a welcome sound after the oppressive silence of the gray world. He jammed the truck into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and peeled out of the parking lot without a backward glance. He didn't stop until the flickering neon sign of the Restmorin was a distant memory in his rearview mirror, a malevolent star receding into the darkness. Even then, he kept his foot pressed hard on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing back towards that reckless 90 miles per hour. But this time, it wasn't a desperate flight from grief, it was a frantic escape from something far more terrifying. The cold night air rushing through the open windows no longer felt cleansing. Now, it carried the phantom whispers of trapped souls and the image of a jawless smile. He glanced at the passenger seat, where the manila envelope lay like a physical manifestation of his ruined life. It no longer held his sole focus. The sterile words within seemed insignificant compared to the horrors he had just witnessed. He drove for what felt like hours, the landscape blurring into an indistinguishable mass in the periphery. He had no destination in mind, only the primal urge to put as much distance as possible between himself and the Restmorin. The beer cans on the floor rattled with the truck's vibrations, a reminder of his initial despair, now overshadowed by a more immediate and visceral fear. As the first hints of a bruised dawn began to paint the eastern sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the fields, exhaustion finally began to claim him. His eyelids felt heavy, his muscles ached, and the adrenaline that had fueled his escape began to wane, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. He spotted a small, unassuming gas station huddled beside the highway, its fluorescent lights casting a weak glow in the pre-dawn gloom. He pulled in, the rumble of the truck's engine a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the Restmorin. He filled the gas tank, the mundane task feeling strangely surreal after the night he'd endured. Inside the brightly lit convenience store, the normalcy of the early morning, a sleepy attendant behind the counter, the murmur of a local news broadcast on a small television, felt alien. He bought a coffee, the bitter warmth a small comfort as he tried to piece together the fragmented horrors he had witnessed. What had that place been? A nightmare? A hallucination brought on by grief and alcohol? But it had felt so real, so tangible. The cold air, the rough texture of the iron ring, the weight of the gray atmosphere, it couldn't have all been in his head. And the clerk, that grotesque, knowing creature. Its words echoed in his mind, "You belong here. Do what you came to do." What did that even mean? What had he come to do? He had simply been trying to escape his own pain. He sat in his truck, the lukewarm coffee doing little to dispel the bone-deep chill. He looked at the manila envelope on the passenger seat. The reason for his initial despair. Had he somehow been drawn to that place because of his grief? Were the trapped souls in the Restmorin all victims of their own despair, their final moments replaying endlessly? A disturbing thought took root in his mind. The clerk had said they had come for the same reasons he did. Had his own self-destructive path, his drunken flight from reality, somehow led him to that cursed place? Was he, in some way, meant to join them? He shuddered, pushing the thought away. He had escaped. He was alive. He would never go back. But even as he told himself this, a seed of unease remained. The void in the ceiling of room 6, it had been a way out, but also a way in. And the clerk's final words, they lingered in the silence of the early morning, a chilling premonition that his encounter with the Restmorin might not be over. He started the engine again, the rising sun casting long shadows ahead. He had a new destination now, though he didn't know exactly where it was. All he knew was that he had to keep driving, keep moving, and try to outrun the lingering darkness that had followed him from the Restmorin. He had to understand what that place was, and why he had been drawn there, before it drew him back. The endless miles blurred into a monotonous ribbon of asphalt. The rising sun eventually burned off the early morning haze, revealing a landscape indifferent to his inner turmoil. Frank had stopped only for gas and more coffee, pushing onward with a desperate need to keep moving, to leave the horrors of the Restmorin firmly in his past. By mid-morning, he found himself on a quieter stretch of highway, the traffic thinning. He'd rolled down the window, the warmer air a small comfort against the persistent chill that seemed to cling to him. He reached for his coffee cup, only to find it empty. Sighing, he glanced around for a place to stop. Up ahead, a small, roadside diner appeared like a mirage, its faded sign proclaiming "Blues Eats." It looked ordinary enough, a welcome beacon of normalcy. Frank signaled and pulled into the dusty parking lot, the gravel crunching under his tires. He stepped out of the truck, stretching his stiff limbs. The air smelled of frying bacon and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the musty, metallic odor of the Restmore Inn. He took a deep breath, trying to ground himself in the mundane reality of a roadside diner. Inside, the diner was almost empty. A couple sat at the counter, nursing mugs of coffee and speaking in low tones. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read "Doris" gestured him towards a booth. Frank slid into the worn vinyl, the familiar squeak a small comfort. "Coffee?" Doris asked, her voice flat. "Please," Frank replied, managing a weak smile. She returned quickly with a steaming mug. Frank took a long sip, the bitter liquid warming him from the inside out. He felt a flicker of relief, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he had truly left that nightmare behind. He was halfway through his coffee when he noticed it. On the wall opposite his booth hung a framed photograph. It was a black and white image of a roadside motel. The style looked dated, the cars parked out front classic models. But it was the motel itself that made his blood run cold. It was the Restmore Inn. The same distinctive, slightly dilapidated structure. The same placement beside a lonely off-ramp. Even the flickering neon sign, though frozen in monochrome, seemed eerily familiar. Frank stared at the photograph, his hand clenching around his coffee mug. He blinked, wondering if exhaustion was finally playing tricks on his eyes. He looked away, then back again. The photograph remained. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. What were the odds of finding a photograph of that specific, obscure motel in a random diner miles away? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a common motel design from a certain era. Maybe he was just hyper-aware, seeing connections where none existed. But the feeling persisted, a deep, unsettling certainty that the Restmore Inn was somehow reaching out to him. His gaze drifted back to the photograph. He focused on the sign. In the black and white image, it was difficult to make out the exact wording, but the shape and position of the flickering letters were unmistakable. Then he noticed something else, something even more disturbing. Standing in the doorway of the motel in the photograph, a shadowy figure was just barely visible. It was tall and gaunt, its form indistinct in the grainy image. But something about its posture, the unnatural angle of its head, sent a fresh wave of terror washing over Frank. It looked like the clerk. Frank's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a sudden urge to bolt, to run as far and as fast as he could from this diner, from this inescapable feeling of being watched. He forced himself to take another sip of coffee, his hand trembling so badly the mug rattled against his teeth. He had to be imagining things. It was just a photograph. Just a motel. But the cold knot of fear in his stomach told him otherwise. The Restmore Inn wasn't just a place. It was something else. And it wasn't letting him go. He looked around the diner, his eyes scanning the other patrons. The couple at the counter seemed oblivious, lost in their quiet conversation. Doris wiped down the counter, her expression impassive. Everything seemed normal, ordinary. Except for the photograph on the wall. Frank knew, with a chilling certainty, that his escape had been an illusion. The Restmore Inn, or whatever malevolent force resided within it, was still present, its influence stretching far beyond its desolate location. And somehow, inexplicably, it had found him again. He had to get out of here. Now. He reached for his wallet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He fumbled with the bills, his eyes never leaving the photograph on the wall. The shadowy figure in the doorway seemed to shift slightly in his peripheral vision, though he knew it was just his imagination. He threw a few crumpled bills on the table, not waiting for the change. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing a brief, curious glance from Doris. "Gotta go," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. He hurried out of the diner, the warm air suddenly feeling oppressive. He practically threw himself back into his truck, slamming the door shut. He started the engine, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the steering wheel. He backed out of the parking lot, his eyes fixed on the diner in his rearview mirror. The photograph on the wall seemed to gleam ominously in the sunlight. He didn't see the shadowy figure move, but he felt its gaze, cold and knowing, following him as he sped back onto the highway, his escape turning into a desperate flight once more. Frank gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, his gaze darting nervously between the rear view and side mirrors. The image of the Restmorin photograph in the diner, and the shadowy figure in its doorway, had shaken him to his core. The fleeting sense of escape was gone, replaced by a gnawing paranoia. He felt like prey being stalked by an unseen predator. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were multiple motels with similar names or designs. Maybe the figure in the photograph was just his overactive imagination, fueled by fear and exhaustion. But the feeling of dread persisted, a cold weight in his chest. He drove for several more hours, pushing himself despite the growing fatigue. He avoided stopping, subsisting on lukewarm coffee and stale gas station snacks. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, he noticed a familiar flickering in his rearview mirror. He squinted, his heart pounding in his chest. In the distance, a neon sign pulsed with an unsettling red glow. As he drove further, the shape became clearer. Restmorin, vacancy. His blood ran cold. It couldn't be. He had driven for hundreds of miles, across state lines according to the faded highway signs he'd barely registered. How could that motel be here? He gripped the steering wheel even tighter, his mind racing. Was he hallucinating? Had he somehow driven in a massive circle without realizing it? He checked his rearview mirror again. The sign was still there, its flickering red letters a malevolent beacon in the twilight. Panic began to set in. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, the truck roaring in response. He had to get away, put more distance between himself and that accursed place. He glanced at his side mirror. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing rapidly larger. He hadn't noticed another car for miles on this deserted stretch of highway. He dismissed it as coincidence, focusing on getting further away from the reappearing motel. But the headlights stayed locked on his tail, gaining ground with unnerving speed. Frank glanced back again. The vehicle behind him was a dark, indistinct shape, its headlights unnaturally bright, almost piercing. A wave of unease washed over him. It felt deliberate, like he was being hunted. He pushed his truck to its limits, the engine straining. He risked a glance in his rearview mirror again. The dark vehicle was closer now, its form starting to resolve. It was a pickup truck, old and battered, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Its headlights seemed to pulse with the same sickly red glow as the Restmorin sign. And as it drew nearer, Frank could make out a figure behind the wheel, a gaunt silhouette that sent a jolt of pure terror through him. The figure's head seemed to tilt at an unnatural angle. Frank's breath hitched. It was the clerk. He knew it was impossible. He had left that place miles behind. But the undeniable image in his rearview mirror, the malevolent presence closing in on him, shattered any semblance of doubt. The Restmore Inn wasn't just a place. It was something that could follow. He swerved violently as the dark truck behind him suddenly accelerated, its horn blaring a distorted, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. The truck bumped his rear fender, sending a shudder through his vehicle. "No! This can't be happening!" Frank yelled, his voice cracking with fear. He floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward. He risked another glance back. The clerk's truck was right behind him, its unnaturally bright headlights filling his cab. He could almost make out the grotesque smile on the driver's face in the rearview mirror. The clerk's truck rammed him again, harder this time, sending him swerving dangerously close to the shoulder. Gravel sprayed as he fought to maintain control. He knew he couldn't outrun it. Whatever that thing was, it was relentless. Up ahead, another familiar sight pierced the twilight. The flickering red neon sign of the Restmore Inn, vacancy, loomed beside another lonely off-ramp. It was as if the highway itself was bending, twisting, leading him back to that cursed place. Desperation clawed at him. He couldn't go back there. He wouldn't. He jerked the wheel, taking the off-ramp at a dangerous speed, just as he had the first time. But this time, there was no sense of drunken impulse. Only pure, unadulterated terror. The clerk's truck followed, its headlights unwavering in his rearview mirror. The Restmore Inn sign grew larger, its red glow bathing the surrounding darkness in an ominous light. Frank knew, with a chilling certainty, that he wasn't escaping. He was being herded. The Restmore Inn wasn't just lingering, it was actively hunting him, drawing him back into its nightmarish embrace. And this time, he had a sinking feeling he wouldn't be leaving. The flickering red glow of the Restmore Inn sign filled Frank's windshield, a hypnotic and terrifying beacon. His mind screamed in protest, every instinct urging him to veer away, to escape the invisible tendrils that seemed to be pulling him back. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, the tires screaming in protest against the asphalt. The pickup truck shuddered violently, fishtailing wildly. In his rearview mirror, the headlights of the clerk's truck swerved in response, still relentlessly closing the distance. The sudden, violent maneuver threw Frank against his seatbelt. He fought to regain control, his knuckles white as he wrestled with the steering wheel. The truck careened across the lanes, heading towards the grassy shoulder. He overcorrected, and the truck lurched back onto the asphalt, this time veering sharply to the right. The world outside the windows became a blur of passing trees and the encroaching darkness. The red glow of the Restmore Inn sign seemed to mock him, growing larger with terrifying speed. The tires hit the soft, uneven ground of the shoulder, and the truck began to bounce violently. Frank's head slammed against the headrest. He could hear the sickening crunch of metal and the shattering of glass. He fought desperately to steer, but the truck was no longer responding. It was a runaway beast, careening out of control. The headlights of the clerk's truck filled his side mirror, a menacing presence in his final moments of control. Then, with a deafening crash, everything went black. The world returned in fragmented bursts of pain and distorted sounds. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears, punctuated by the groaning of twisted metal and the hiss of leaking fluids. He tasted blood in his mouth and felt a sharp, searing pain in his leg. He was dimly aware of being upside down, the seatbelt digging into his chest. The cab of the truck was a mangled mess of shattered glass and crumpled metal. The sickly red glow of the Restmore Inn sign still filtered through the shattered windshield, impossibly close now. Through the haze of pain, he saw movement outside the truck. A dark silhouette approached the wreckage, its form tall and gaunt. The unnaturally bright headlights of the clerk's truck illuminated the figure, casting long, distorted shadows. Frank tried to move, to escape, but a jolt of agonizing pain shot through his leg. He was trapped. The figure drew closer, and in the dim red glow, Frank could make out the ruined face, the twisted jaw, the wide, knowing smile. The clerk. The creature reached the overturned truck, its long, spindly fingers scraping against the mangled metal. The distorted, guttural sound of its voice echoed through the night. "Welcome back, Mr. Marsh-Eaton," it rasped, the sound laced with a chilling satisfaction. "We've been expecting you." Frank tried to speak, to scream, but only a choked gurgle escaped his lips. He was trapped, broken, and at the mercy of the nightmare that had relentlessly pursued him. The red glow of the Restmore Inn sign seemed to pulse in time with the throbbing pain in his body. The clerk's shadowy form loomed over the wreckage, its grotesque smile widening in the dim light. Frank closed his eyes, the chilling certainty washing over him that his escape had been a futile dream. He was back where he started, or perhaps somewhere far worse. The last thing he heard, before the darkness fully claimed him, was the scraping of metal as the clerk began to pry open the mangled remains of his truck. The next sensation was not the jarring pain of the crash, nor the chilling presence of the clerk. Instead, a dull ache throbbed behind Frank's eyes, and the air around him was thick with a familiar musty scent. He blinked, his vision blurry at first, then slowly focusing. He was lying on the worn, gray bedspread of room 6. The monochromatic stillness of the grayscale world surrounded him. The peeling gray wallpaper, the silent gray desk, the muted light filtering through the grimy gray window, it was all exactly as he had left it. Disorientation washed over him. Had the chase, the crash, had it all been a nightmare within a nightmare? He tried to sit up, and a sharp pain shot through his leg. He looked down and saw his jeans were torn, the fabric stained a dark, matte gray. His ankle throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. It hadn't been a dream. The crash had been real. The clerk, that horrifying entity, had been real. But how had he ended up back here, in this silent, colorless version of room 6? He pushed himself up slowly, wincing at the pain in his leg. The gray room seemed to press in on him, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of his heart. He looked towards the ceiling. The dark, rectangular void was still there, a silent reminder of his initial descent. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his injured ankle protesting with a jolt of pain. He had to move, had to understand what was happening. He stood, putting weight gingerly on his uninjured leg, using the edge of the bed for support. He took a tentative step. The gray floor felt cold and hard beneath his bare feet. He looked down and realized his shoes were gone. He moved slowly towards the door, his gaze sweeping across the room. Everything was as it had been, yet imbued with a deeper sense of wrongness, of being trapped in a perpetual state of decay. He reached the gray doorknob, his hand trembling slightly as he turned it. The door creaked open silently, revealing the familiar gray walkway. The doors to the other rooms stood ajar, each one a silent testament to the endless torment within. He hesitated at the threshold, a wave of despair washing over him. He had tried to escape. He had crashed trying to avoid returning. Yet here he was, back in the suffocating embrace of the Restmore Inn's gray reality. It was as if the motel itself had an inescapable gravity, pulling him back no matter how hard he fought. A faint sound reached his ears, a dry, grating scrape from the direction of the office. He knew, with a chilling certainty, who was waiting for him there. He looked back at the void in the ceiling, a desperate thought forming in his mind. It had been an exit once. Could it be again? Was that his only chance, a leap into the unknown rather than facing the knowing horror that awaited him in the gray office? He took a step back towards the bed, his gaze fixed on the dark rectangle above. His ankle throbbed, a constant reminder of his failed escape. But the alternative, facing the clerk again, felt like a descent into utter madness. The scraping sound from the office grew slightly louder, closer. He could almost hear the faint, distorted rasp of the clerk's voice. Decision made. Ignoring the pain in his leg, Frank began to move towards the bed, his eyes locked on the void in the ceiling, his last desperate hope for escape. The scraping sound from the office grew louder, closer, accompanied now by the faint, wet rasp of the clerk's voice, just beyond the threshold of the gray room. Frank's breath hitched. He was running out of time. He pushed off the bed, ignoring the searing pain in his ankle, and hobbled as quickly as he could towards the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the dark void in the ceiling. It seemed miles away, an unreachable sanctuary. Just as he took another clumsy step, the gray door to room 6 creaked open further, revealing the gaunt silhouette of the clerk framed against the slightly brighter gray of the walkway. The creature's head tilted at that unnatural angle, and the wide, ruined smile stretched across its face. "Trying to leave so soon, Mr. Marsh-Eaton," the clerk's voice rasped, the sound like dry bones grinding together. It took a slow, deliberate step into the room, its long, spindly limbs moving with an unsettling fluidity. Frank froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. The void in the ceiling felt impossibly distant now, any hope of reaching it extinguished by the creature's presence. He was trapped. Again. He could only stare at the clerk, a raw terror seizing him. The creature's gray eyes, devoid of any warmth or humanity, seemed to pierce right through him, seeing not just his fear but something deeper, something he didn't understand. The clerk took another step, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The sickly light from the walkway cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the gray walls. "You can't escape, Mr. Marsh-Eaton," the clerk continued, its voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to slither into his mind. "This place, it has its reasons for keeping its guests." Frank tried to back away, but his injured ankle buckled beneath him, and he stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the gray desk. He felt utterly helpless, cornered in this silent, colorless nightmare. The clerk continued to advance, its ruined smile never faltering. Its long, gray fingers twitched, as if eager to reach him. "You belong here," it repeated, the same chilling words from before. "Just like the others. You'll understand soon enough." Understanding. The word hung in the still air, heavy with unspoken dread. What was there to understand? The endless torment of the trapped souls. His own inexplicable return. The clerk was just a few feet away now, its presence radiating a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to drain the very life from the gray room. Frank could see the intricate network of shadows and sinew that held its ruined jaw together, the unnatural gleam in its dead eyes. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. He didn't know what the clerk intended to do, but after witnessing the horrors of the other rooms, he could only imagine it would be something unspeakable. But instead of a physical touch, a cold wave of something else washed over him. It felt like a probing, an invasion of his thoughts, his memories, his deepest fears. Images flashed behind his eyelids. The lawyer's sterile office, the manila envelope, the empty beer cans on the floor of his truck, the fleeting moments of connection in his past relationship now twisted with the pain of loss. The clerk's voice echoed in his mind, not through his ears, but directly into his consciousness. "Your pain, it resonates here, Mr. Marsh-Eaton. It feeds this place. Just as theirs do." Frank's eyes snapped open. He stared at the clerk, a dawning horror beginning to bloom within him. Was that it? Was his grief, his despair, the reason he was trapped here? Had his own darkness somehow attracted this nightmare? The clerk's ruined smile seemed to widen further, as if acknowledging his horrifying realization. "You see now," the voice echoed in his mind, cold and triumphant. "You are one of us now, Mr. Marsh-Eaton. And in time, you will linger here too. The clerk reached out a long, gray hand. This time, Frank didn't flinch. A strange sense of resignation began to settle over him, a horrifying acceptance of his fate in this place where nightmares lingered. The clerk's cold, gray fingers brushed against Frank's arm, and a wave of icy dread washed over him. The touch felt strangely familiar, as if a forgotten part of him recognized this coldness. The gray room around him seemed to shimmer, the muted colors intensifying slightly before fading back to their dull monotony. The clerk's ruined face remained inches from his, its knowing gaze unwavering. "It's time, Mr. Marsh-Eaton," the voice echoed in his mind, the triumphant tone sending a shiver down Frank's spine. "Time to relive. Time to understand." Suddenly, the gray room began to spin. Not violently, but with a slow, disorienting rotation that made Frank's stomach churn. The image of the clerk's face blurred, then sharpened again, its smile seeming to grow even wider. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on him. A low, indistinct murmur filled the room, a chorus of hushed whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. They sounded like sighs, like quiet sobs, like the last breaths of the dying. Then, the gray room dissolved. Frank found himself standing not in the motel room, but on a cracked asphalt parking lot under a ghastly blue moonlight. The cold night air rushed across his face. In his hand, he held a half-empty can of beer. The familiar weight of the manila envelope pressed against his leg where it rested on the passenger seat of his pickup truck. Confusion warred with a dawning, terrifying recognition. This was the night he had arrived. The beginning. He took a tentative step, the gravel crunching beneath his worn boots. The flickering neon sign of the Restmore Inn vacancy pulsed in the distance, beckoning him closer. A wave of nausea washed over him as the memories of the grayscale world flooded back. The hanging man, the woman with the pills, the jawless smile of the clerk. He knew what awaited him if he followed that sign. But an invisible force seemed to be guiding him, a subtle pull that he couldn't resist. It was as if the events of that night were etched in time, a loop he was destined to repeat. He tried to turn away, to get back in his truck and drive in the opposite direction, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him slowly towards the lonely off-ramp that led to the Restmore Inn. He could hear his own thoughts from that night echoing in his mind, barreling down the highway, no real destination, another pull from his beer. He watched his hand raise the beer can to his lips, the cold aluminum a stark contrast to the icy dread in his heart. He tried to stop himself, to shout a warning, but no sound escaped his throat. He was a ghost in his own past, a silent observer trapped in a recurring nightmare. He saw himself jerk the wheel, the tires screeching as he took the off-ramp. He watched himself pull into the cracked gravel parking lot, the red vacancy sign pulsing like a weak heartbeat. He was reliving it all, moment by agonizing moment, but with the horrifying knowledge of what lay ahead. The encounter with the suspicious attendant, the heavy metal key, the peeling paint of room 6. He felt the weight of the manila envelope in his hand as he entered the familiar, yet now sinister, motel room. He saw himself sit on the edge of the bed, the silence and stillness giving him room to think, room for the grief to take hold. And then, the tears welled up, the same raw, uncontrollable sobs shaking his body. He turned towards the wall, ashamed of his vulnerability, just as he had before. He reached for the beer, his fingers trembling, the can slipping and rolling beneath the bed. He watched himself kneel down, lift the bed skirt, and freeze. The slow, scraping sound. The faint whispers. He knew what was beneath the bed. He knew about the hatch, the cold iron ring, the strange carvings. He knew about the grayscale world, the repeating deaths, the smiling clerk. He was trapped in the loop of his arrival, forced to relive the beginning of his nightmare with the full weight of his horrifying experience. The clerk's words echoed in his mind, time to relive. Time to understand. But what was there to understand? That his grief had led him here. That he was destined to repeat this nightmarish cycle forever. As his past self reached for the iron ring of the hatch, a cold dread settled over Frank. He knew what lay beneath. He knew the horror that awaited. And he was powerless to stop it. He was caught in his own loop, a prisoner of his past and the Restmore's malevolent embrace.